Way back in time, 450 years back, there was a land of winding creeks, lush forests, and sprawling meadowlands. This land was an uncharted mosaic of natural beauty. The many and various wild animals of the day roamed the forests freely, for there was always a natural spring or stream nearby to quench their thirst. The animals weren't the only ones to appreciate the natural blessings of this land. The red man felt one with the land upon which he lived. The Indians looked at their world and saw a kind of divine tranquility, a tranquility that was soon to end. In 1540, De Soto began his trek across southeast North America searching for gold. These pale faces weren't out to establish a reputation for congeniality, as the Indians quickly discovered, and battles soon claimed the lives of many Spaniards and Indians alike. Adding insult to injury, the Old World visitors brought Old World diseases to the Indian nation. As the germs spread, so did the graves of the Indians throughout the wilderness. This land of winding creeks and dense forests, of which we have spoken, was quickly repopulated with Muskogee Indians who migrated up from Central America. This was to be a paradise lost, for in 1811 the white man came exploring once more. This time their metal helmets were replaced with coonskin caps as hunters and pioneers from Tennessee, Georgia, and the Carolinas began to meander about the valleys and hills. These young Daniel Boones found Indian villages situated near rivers, creeks, and springs. Narrow paths connected these mud-thatched towns. Since the pioneers were not yet trying to claim homesteading land, the Indians allowed them to hunt freely within their forests. When the United States and England got back into war in 1812, the British saw an opportunity to feed upon the fear certain tribes had for the advance of the white man into their land. The British promised to help the Indians keep their land in exchange for their help in fighting the Americans. Many of the Creeks allied with England, and they became known as Red Sticks. Most of the Creeks were still hesitant to start warring with those whites, who were now trying to homestead. But then the great Shawnee chief Tecumseh visited the area. Tecumseh believed in a great Indian alliance devoted to driving out the white man. He was a great persuader. He talked. The Creeks tomahawked, right through the scalps of some of the first settlers. The battles of Burnt Corn Creek in 1813 and the Fort Mims massacre that same year were powerful suggestions that the Indians of the area were like other tribes in the young nation, declaring nothing short of total war against the white man. At least this is how the U.S. government officials saw it. General Andrew Jackson was put in command of 2,500 troops and sent into the Coosa River wilderness to put a stop to the bloodshed. They cut a road known as Jackson's Trace through the forests right down along the Coosa. Along this route, near Canoe Creek, the Creek town of Littafatchee was discovered and destroyed. Jackson built Fort Strother along the Coosa's banks and used it as his headquarters during the Creek Indian War. This site lay well within the easternmost boundary of what was later to become known as St. Clair County. Jackson, Old Hickory as he was called, fought mutiny and supply shortages in his efforts to manage his 3,000 to 5,000 troops stationed at Fort Strother. A maintained supply of 1,000 gallons of whiskey most probably helped him and his men tolerate the wilderness a bit more bravely. The unmarked graves of these soldiers remain until this day as the sole testimonial to their ever having stayed here. Despite the fact that great numbers of Creeks and Cherokees remained friendly toward the white settlers, with some even helping Jackson fight their Red Stick brothers, they were still forced into signing the Treaty of Fort Jackson. This treaty ceded Indian lands over to the federal government. Though the lands around what was to become St. Clair County now belonged to the U.S. government, the Creeks and Cherokees still remained there, with many fostering a strong contempt for the white man and his government. Those few whites who did try to settle here were sometimes scalped, tortured, or captured by some of the most hostile Indians. It is important to remember that many Creeks and Cherokees kept trying to live in peace with the first homesteaders. Sometimes peaceful Indians, along with the violent ones, were murdered or abused by the settling whites. Despite the violence of these times, homesteading began to accelerate in the St. Clair area. In 1814, Captain Edward Beeson, a Revolutionary War veteran, came into the magnificent valley at the foot of Chandler Mountain and made it his home. The house the Beeson family completed in the 1840s stands with such splendor that it's the crown jewel of the valley to this day. His family and their descendants rest in a nearby cemetery. On a little less permanent basis, you can rest at this old Beeson home, for it is now a bed and breakfast inn, open to visitors. One family of homesteaders met personal tragedy that had nothing to do with Indian conflict. In 1817, a wagon train from the Carolinas was passing through Lower Beaver Valley. In these wagons were the Newton and Ash families, heading west looking for homesteading land. During a hunting foray, the little daughter of John and Margaret Ash fell from one of the wagons and died shortly thereafter from a head injury. The Ash family buried her on a little rise by the creek. Here sat the little grave of Betsy Ann Ash, alone in the wilderness. John and Margaret Ash could not bear to leave it behind, and decided to make their home within 500 yards of their little girl's final resting place. Their first cabin, built in 1817, still stands proudly in a grassy clearing near Betsy Ann's grave. When John Ash's in-laws moved into the cabin, he built a massive two-story home for his own family. Though finished in 1818, this house is still standing just off Highway 411 and looks much like it did the day it was finished. This same year, 1818, the Alabama Territory was created. Several counties were designated within this territory. Shelby County was one of these. When the territorial legislature met again in November 1818, so many families had now settled into the northern portion of Shelby County that it was necessary to create an entirely new county. It was named after General Arthur St. Clair, a Scotsman who fought under George Washington in the Revolutionary War. It was also determined that St. Clair County's courts be held at Alexander Brown's trading post near the Creek village of Littafatchie. This village served as an arrowhead manufacturing center for the Creeks. Chief Catala kept the main population of this Creek tribe further east along the banks of the Coosa River. Between these 2 points lay a tranquil valley that homesteaders were finding to be just the place they'd been searching for. One of these homesteaders was John Looney. When he and his brother retired from Andrew Jackson's force, they came to Beaver Valley to settle. In 1820, Henry finished building his home. Its 16-inch logs used the dovetail lock and wooden pegs to hold them in place. The chimneys are hand-pressed brick and sport their original mantels. Today, the old steps still lead upstairs to the bedrooms, one of which now serves as a museum. In fact, the entire Looney home has been preserved and restored by the St. Clair County Historical Society, and today is open to visitors. History lovers will find this house is unrivaled in all of America for revealing the lifestyles of the pioneers of this era. To watch the flames flicker in the old Looney homestead is to reflect on the many joys and sorrows of the original dwellers of this grand old structure. The first settlers in St. Clair County pursued one basic career, that of farming, hunting, and stock tending to feed their families. Cooking was done on a huge fireplace in the kitchen, utilizing massive iron pots, cups, and utensils. Fire was created with flints. This technique was so laborious that when a fire went out in a homesteader's fireplace, they would go borrow a hot coal from a neighbor to rekindle it, provided they were lucky enough to have such a neighbor. Milk and butter was put into earthen or wooden containers and submerged in cool springs or wells. Meat was preserved by drying, smoking, salting, and then storing it in the old smokehouse. Vegetables and fruits were dried and stored in earthen pots. While John Looney's family was settling into their home, Bolivar and Sarah Eason and their children became the first white settlers in a community that was to become known as Easonville. It was situated on the banks of the Coosa River. By 1820, homesteading was taking place in every section of St. Clair County. Epps Moody built his log cabin near the center of the county. Other Carolina families moved in around him, creating Odenville just a few miles from the village of Moody, Branchville to the northeast, and Big Spring to the west. The natural springs of this area were an unending source of clean water for drinking, cooking, and washing. This was particularly true in the southeastern section of the county, where pioneers began homesteading as early as 1817. By the time Thomas King's family moved here in 1820, the Big Spring community was starting to bubble forth with people, just like the town spring bubbled forth sparkling clean drinking water to be enjoyed by its populace. Big Spring became Springville in 1834. By 1822, St. Clair County's residents saw a crude network of roads beginning to connect their communities and realized an immediate need for those social organizations that enabled families to live together in peace and prosperity. Ashville saw the erection of a log county courthouse, jail, and general store, which also served as a post office. Stagecoaches were now traveling regularly between Ashville and Huntsville. Jacob Green's house was a famous stop along this route. The early settlers brought their faith with them into St. Clair County, so Reverend Hearns found it easy to establish a Methodist society around Ashville in the 1820s. These Methodists worshipped in the Mount Pleasant Meeting House until they built their own church in 1854. Over in Steele, Dearman's Chapel and Union Methodists were organized in 1820. The Baptists built their church between 1840 and 1850. About this time, during this democratic establishing of churches, a very undemocratic event occurred. On September 27, 1830, a so-called treaty was signed forcing the Choctaw Indians to either declare their citizenship to the United States or relocate on small reservations west of the Mississippi River. Many who declared their citizenship were never given the land grants they were promised. Within just a few years, the Creeks and Cherokees were forced off their lands in much the same manner. This long, humiliating trek from the southeast onto barren reservations in Arkansas and Oklahoma became known as the Trail of Tears. Many older American history books failed to devote much attention to this tragedy. But a greater problem than inaccurate history books is that of no history books. History books were a rarity in the first St. Clair County schools, which were really little more than log cabins. They usually had a dirt or boarded floor and maybe a wood stove for heat. Villages were hard-pressed to recruit a teacher to move to the area to educate their children. From about 1825 to 1840, the quality of life began to reach quite a higher level for many of the county's first homesteaders. People were showing faith in their families' futures by constructing homes of much splendor. The town square in Asheville had quickly constructed mansions, almost forming a wall around it. There was the Embry home, the Byers house, Collins home, Pickett home, and later on in 1852, the Inzer home. Beaver Valley saw the Yarborough home built in 1825 and the Phillips home completed in 1847. St. Clair County settlers were now becoming more than dirt farmers and game hunters. The arrival of lawyers, teachers, bankers, physicians, shop owners, and government officials began to change things. Dr. Bothwell and Dr. Farrar set up medical practice just off Asheville's town square. Judge Inzer practiced law while Dr. Bass ran a drugstore out of the same Asheville building. As the population of Asheville became significant around 1844, the decision was made to build a new brick courthouse. The bricks were formed and dried in wooden molds. One of these molds, as well as countless other early Asheville artifacts and documents, are now on display in the museum adjoining the Asheville Public Library. Other historical papers are available for viewing nearby in the courthouse. By 1830, St. Clair County became a commercial and social structure that not only communicated within its own boundaries, but with the rest of the nation as well. Old Jacob Green recognized ferry service across the Coosa would quicken the transport of mail into and out of the county. He docked his ferry at a point on the river that was to become known as Greensport. While Green's ferry successfully carried people, mail, and dry goods across the river, flatboats began to move the same baggage down the Coosa. Without engine power or the necessary current, these little crafts could never move back upstream. Most folks think of the Mississippi River when they think of steamboats. However, by the 1850s, steamboats were also churning the Coosa between Greensport and Rome, Georgia. Though their primary purpose was to carry cotton, farm produce, and mail, they also were a great source of recreation for the wealthy. Affluent citizens of the day often enjoyed riverboat excursions that featured dining, dancing, and popular games of the day. The image of steamboats is one of the most charming in the Old South. Their presence was certainly a direct result of the massive farms the settlers were establishing in the 1830s and 1840s. A not-so element of these, an element in farms was slavery. By the 1850s, there were over 2,000 black slaves in St. Clair, like few of the wealthiest Creek Indians. U.S. stayed in St. Clair County. Many of the slaves were brought in by those who settled at Easonville. These particular homesteaders, for the most part, came into the county with wealth. Their big homes, fine furniture, musical instruments, and other articles of culture made Easonville at the top of the social ladder of the county's communities. Over in Ashville, things were getting a bit sophisticated also. Merchant Moses Dean even went so far as to have a massive rock brought to the foot of his store solely for the purpose of enabling his lady customers to mount their horses more proper-like. Unfortunately, the rock lost some of its class when it became an auction block for slaves. Today it is still right here in Asheville, a witness to countless good times and bad. The contrasting purposes for a single large rock were poetically symbolic for the tragedy that burst onto the American scene in 1861. The comforts of the white settlers were no longer to be sustained by acts of human slavery. The first shot of the Civil War was fired at Fort Sumter in 1861, but it was quickly felt by the families of St. Clair County. Company A, 10th Alabama Infantry Regiment, formed under an old oak tree at Asheville's Court Square. A grassy knoll at the village of Cropwell served as the gathering point for Company F of the 10th Alabama Infantry Regiment. A monument stands at this very spot honoring these young men of Company F. Hundreds of other lads marched out of the county toward a sort of glorious uncertainty. Places like Spotsylvania, Gettysburg, and Appomattox showed them one certainty: war scoffs at glory. 26 of Company A's 103 men were killed in battle. Others died from disease. Still others lived through or succumbed to the horrors of a prisoner of war camp. Just listen to a passage from John Inser's diary, written while he was in a Union prison at Johnson's Island. Tuesday, December 13, 1864. Part of prisoners tried to scale the wall last night. Some went over, some turned back. Lieutenant Bowles killed at fence. Many shots fired. John Inser was lucky. He made it back to Asheville in one piece. Over in Steele, some families watched sons return from the war wearing gray. Others had sons return wearing blue. Not unlike many communities in north-central Alabama around 1861, there was a division of loyalty toward the Union and the Confederacy. St. Clair County was an easy victory for the Union forces moving through to join General Sherman in Atlanta. A Union officer wrote in his diary, "The men marched into Asheville in the morning and remained for several hours, getting the horses completely shod while there. All places of business were closed, and most of the citizens had fled in terror at the approach of the dreaded Yankees." Today, the older cemeteries of St. Clair County are a haunting roll call of the fallen from almost every major battle of the Civil War. And so with 1865 came a new era for the county. The slaves were freed, although many weren't quite sure what to do with their newfound rights. Freedom for all from intimidation and exploitation certainly wasn't the order of the day. The carpetbaggers swarmed into the Reconstruction era of the South like starving locusts swarm a field of grain. The failure to provide the freed slaves with any economic base from which to grow coupled with the ruthless ambitions of Northern investors toward economic opportunity in the defeated South, led to a simple struggle of survival for all Southerners. The poverty of the defeated was immense. Families now brewed burnt corn in place of coffee. They preserved meat with remains of salt found under their smokehouses. Land and goods were also the ill-gotten booty of carpetbagger swindlers. Other forms of thievery were committed by Northern visitors who sincerely believed the South needed to be made over their way if it was to prosper at all. To them, the chance to gain power and wealth in a defeated South was a necessary element for achieving a new prosperity. By the early 1870s, freed slaves were finally starting to rent some plots of land from their old plantation owners. Many prospered to a point where they would actually buy their own modest farms. Tenant houses and two-horse farms appeared where once there were plantations. Store owners, bankers, lawyers, newspaper publishers, and doctors prospered. Small towns were born, with whites and blacks moving in to create a totally new form of self-sustaining economies. In 1866, a few creative Southerners formed ties with Northern investors and shrewdly looked at the growing network of Southern towns that were poised for harvesting the natural resources of the area. In 1870, the Alabama Great Southern Railroad was built through St. Clair County. The community of Steele built a hotel beside it. It still stands. Down in Jones Valley, two new railroads crossed and the city of Birmingham was well on its way to becoming an industrial giant. The DeBartoleben family not only helped build Birmingham, but was instrumental in creating the St. Clair County towns of Margaret and Akmar, explicitly for mining the rich St. Clair coal that would help build Birmingham steel furnaces. In 1907, passenger service was established from Atlanta through the county into Birmingham. Where the rails passed by the Coosa River, there rose the town of Riverside. It was home for several prosperous lumber mills. Logs were floated downriver to the Riverside mills and then shipped by train throughout the states. The Coleman and Morris homes are well-preserved proof of the early significance Riverside played in the county's economy. Over in Ragland, brick making and cement production led to the chartering of the Bank of Ragland. Ragland brick is contained in the homes and buildings of many of our fellow Americans throughout the nation. In 1900, the railroads were merging at several points in St. Clair County. One such place was Pell City. With its 3 railroads, Pell City quickly caught the eye of investors. Streets were built. More houses went up. New residents found it difficult to transgress massive Backbone Mountain to reach the county seat of Ashville. To make things easier, an ordinance was passed in Montgomery that made Pell City a branch county seat. Up went a new courthouse, along with some new businesses like the Pell City Manufacturing Company, the First National Bank of Pell City, and the John Blair McAfee Company. The first sawtooth cotton mill in the South was built in Pell City in 1902. Within 1 year, it brought 1,500 new citizens to town. In 1919, Pell City Manufacturing became Avondale Mills and quickly established itself as the county's largest employer. Yes, both St. Clair County and Pell City's populations had really grown by 1918. Then came World War I. In proportion to population, only one other town in the United States provided more soldiers to the struggle than did Pell City. The war passed. Many died. Others returned home to continue what was left of their lives. It can be said the 20s was the decade of the automobile. Farmer and townsman alike came to know the roads of St. Clair County, as well as they knew the names of their own children, who often sat behind them on those dusty, sputtering excursions. The hot sulfur baths of Cook Springs Resort was now within reach of fun-loving people from all over, including nearby Birmingham. St. Clair Springs was also a center for these new mobile merrymakers. Besides enjoying its healthy mineral springs, visitors could also indulge in dancing and good eating at the resort hotel and cottages. On Kelly Creek, Camp Winnetasca became a good times haven for Boy Scouts and Boys Club members. As with the rest of America during the 20s, businesses of all kinds were flourishing in St. Clair County. The quality of life improved with the arrival of the telephone and electricity. But the real shock lay just ahead. In the Great Depression of the 30s, almost as the pioneer days, the county's residents were once again trying to live off the land. They had very little money. The mines paid its workers with wooden tokens that were redeemable for merchandise at the mine's very own general store. The old saying, "Don't take any wooden nickels," was born. President Roosevelt's New Deal policies were instrumental in bringing the county back to a level of economic respectability. The development of the Tennessee Valley Authority created paying jobs for thousands of Alabamians who had not known a salary for the past several years. The steel mills of Birmingham were also starting to glow with reactivity. They not only provided labor for some of St. Clair County's men, but rejuvenated the sluggish coal and ore mining industries of the area. Yes, by the late 1930s, men once again were marching off to jobs that could feed and clothe their families. Thousands of miles away, on another continent, large masses of men were also marching ruthlessly across the borders of defenseless nations in an effort to claim conquered territory for a deranged Führer. Men and women of St. Clair County boarded trains at Pell City and nearby Leeds and headed to Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific to stop the world domination ambitions of the Axis powers. For hundreds of St. Clair citizens, the defeat of world tyranny was paid for with their lives. Those that made it home alive were eager to get back to their businesses, farms, or labor positions. The post-war era saw the county build newer and better schools, larger churches, more modern public buildings, and innovative businesses. Despite the accepted use of natural gas bringing about the closing of the Alabama Fuel and Iron Company in 1950 and loss of more young lives in Korea and Vietnam, St. Clair County observed a moderate growth through the 50s and 60s. In 1968, Alabama Power altered the flow of the Coosa River with a large dam and consequently altered the economic structure of the county. The resulting Lake Logan Martin brought thousands seeking its boating, skiing, and fishing charms. Many built homes by the lake and hung their hats. Today, the recreational appeal of St. Clair County is truly one of its strong points. It attracts sportsmen, sun lovers, and retirees alike. The county has now become a naturalistic and economic haven, offering so much for those who truly want to experience a quality lifestyle. There's horse breeding and training farms from one end of the county to the other. Cattle and crops can be found in the valleys and flatlands between. Those that love camping have their choice of accommodating campgrounds. Wilderness areas, housing divisions, industrial and recreational parks coexist in a clean and conscientious environment. Even interstates I-20 and I-59 seem as much as four-lane nature trails as they are highways. Small-town courtyards still thrive, as does Main Street, USA. Along with the old homes, museums are well maintained to reward the curious as well as the serious history buff. The Cherokees are currently planning to create a cultural center and living village near Camp Winnetasca. St. Clair County's first white settlers would certainly be proud of the care that has been taken for their old homesteads. And we certainly should be proud of these first citizens and their history, for it is actually our own history here in this most unique and scenic county. Perhaps this realization explains the enthusiastic centennial celebration by the Pell City folks in 1990. To research and explore St. Clair County's history is to get into the hearts and minds of those who came before us. The result is a greater understanding of ourselves and our place in society. Such a journey is not only informative, but fun. To better understand the present, one must first have an understanding of the past. The St. Clair Historical Society invites you to take this journey by visiting one of the county libraries where this video will be available for checkout, along with books pertaining to the county and its cities. And the next time you are in Asheville, be sure to visit the Asheville Library's Museum and Archives Room.